Well, good morning and welcome to our last day. We'll start off with Andrea Kern's talk about perception and the capacity to know, two varieties of Kantianism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for organizing the conference and for inviting me to present a paper. The paper will take up a topic that I think has been addressed in several other talks that we have heard. It's about Kant's two-stem doctrine, how it plays out more particularly in the question how judgment relates to perception. It has been argued that acts of thinking and judging must be rationally constrained by something other than acts of thinking and judging in order to have a content that purports to represent how things are. The capacity for judgment is not a self-standing capacity, but one that must cooperate with another capacity. It has also been argued that this is a Kantian idea, and that Kant's so-called two-stem doctrine of sensibility and understanding gives voice to this insight. However, there has been dispute about how to understand this insight in systematic terms, and equally about how to understand Kant's own way to understand this insight. I will discuss two conflicting readings of this doctrine that I find particularly interesting because both of them do not only take themselves to thereby interpret the Kantian distinction, but each of them defends this reading of the distinction in systematic terms. I will call the first reading, or that's how this reading calls itself, the minimal empiricist reading, and the second reading, the rationalist reading. Of course, this is already perplexing in a discussion of Kant, because he takes himself to address whatever form of empiricism and whatever form of rationalism, and to find a third alternative. So you might also take the topic of my talk to be, has Kant found a third alternative that overcomes the dilemma between empiricism and rationalism? And so what I'm offering is two readings of this insight. Both of them fall into either on the empiricist side or a rationalist version of it. And at the end I will suggest something that points maybe to another reading of Kant, and thereby maybe pointing to a reading that offers maybe a critical alternative. So the core idea of minimal empiricism, and as you all know, so the main John McDowell's version of it, or I take him to be most representative of that reading that is shared, although by many. But so what I mean by minimal empiricism is a position along these lines. The core idea of minimal empiricism is that a self-conscious capacity for perception fulfills the required cooperating role for the capacity for judgment. Because a self-conscious capacity for perception, it is argued, delivers perceptual episodes whose content is not a product of the judgmental activity of the subject. Rather, it is given to the judging subject on account of the object that figures in the content of the judgment in a manner that is available to the subject as a rational constraint on her judgment. Rationalism, by contrast, denies that perception can place a rational constraint on judgment. Perception is a mere enabling condition for judgment, not something that provides a ground for it. I will argue that both readings reflect a misunderstanding about the nature of the distinction between perception and judgment. The debate's topic is the question about how the capacity for perception relates to the capacity for judgment. But for this question to be intelligible, the capacity for judgment and the capacity for perception must be conceived as two distinct capacities, such that one can wonder how they are related to each other. I will argue that this is not what judging is according to Kant. A capacity that relates to the deliverances of another capacity, such as perception, either by being rationally constrained by it, as the minimal empiricist wants it, or by being enabled by it, as the rationalist wants it. Judging, I will suggest at the end, is a capacity, according to Kant, whose activity is not explained by anything other than the capacity that it is said to actualize. The concept of judging, according to Kant, describes a capacity whose exercise is not related to the deliverances of another capacity, but is either directly or indirectly enabled by conditions under which its exercise, when things go well, is revealed to be true to the judging subject, and hence a case of knowledge. So I begin with minimal empiricism and why one might think that this is an appealing reading of Kant and an appealing position in its own terms. According to minimal empiricism, the idea of perception as a rational constraint on judgment belongs to a conception of judgment, according to which judging is an exercise of conceptual capacities that are sui generis. Conceptual capacities are capacities in terms of which we understand what it means for a subject to be a rational being. That's what it meant by they are sui generis. To be a rational being means to be in possession of capacities that enable its subject to make judgments either about how things are or how they ought to be. It is constitutive for the relevant notion of conceptual capacities that their actualization in judgments is dependent upon the subject's ability to justify her judgment by showing that it is, or it is likely to be, as the judging subject claims it to be, that is true. So to possess conceptual capacities in this sense is to possess the capacity for judgment that one could not have if one were not, on occasion, conscious of the ground of one's judgment, in virtue of which judging, qua activity, is conscious of itself, either as an act of knowledge or as something less than knowledge, such as mere opinion or hypothesis. So this connection of conceptual capacities with rationality, I think, is a deeply Kantian idea, and it goes both ways. No concepts without rationality, no rationality without concepts. Concepts, as Kant argues in paragraph 8 of the first critique, are general representations of the understanding that have their home in judgments. In paragraph 8, Kant suggests that therefore the understanding should be identified with the capacity for judgment, of which he then in paragraph 17 and 18 shows that it has self-consciousness as its form. According to the minimal empiricist, this idea should be understood as follows. Judgments are exercises of a subject's self-consciousness in the sense that it is impossible for a subject to bring concepts to a unity whose nexus is the copula without thereby being conscious of the unity to which they are brought. So the minimal empiricist takes himself to thereby give voice to the following Kantian thought that we find in paragraph 15 of the first critique. You find it on the first quotation on the handout. The concept of combination includes, besides the concept of the manifold and its synthesis, also the concept of the unity of the manifold. Combination is a representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold. The representation of this unity cannot therefore arise out of combination. We must therefore look yet higher for this unity, namely in that which itself contains the ground of the unity of the diverse concepts in judgment, and therefore of the possibility of the understanding. So when Kant then goes on to identify this higher unity, which is the unity that is supposed to be the possibility of the understanding, with the unity of self-consciousness, this should be understood as follows, according to the minimal empiricist suggestion. Self-consciousness is the ground of the unity of judgment, not in the sense that it explains the actuality of any particular judgment, but in the sense that it is the ground of its possibility. Judging is an activity of bringing concepts to a unity that is made possible through one's consciousness of the unity to which they are brought. As we will see in what follows, the minimal empiricist and the rationalist will have different ways of spelling out this core idea and thereby give different readings of the relation between judging and perceiving. But so much is common ground between them. And what I take to be, it will become explicit a bit later, to the person that I treat as the representative for the rationalist reading is Barry Stroud, as he explains it in several papers about the centrality of judgment, for example, or the relation perception to judgment. So common ground is to judge that things are thus and so is to combine concepts to a propositional unity that thereby, in being combined to that unity, is endorsed as true. To endorse the truth of a propositional content, the subject must understand the concepts that make up the content of her judgment, and this must be reflected in her understanding of some of the implications that are contained in her endorsement of it, however minimal that understanding might be. She may, for example, understand that to endorse the truth of P entails the endorsement of Q and is incompatible with endorsement of R. So this means that in order for someone to be able to judge that P, she must understand herself to possess a manifold of concepts that she can employ in judgments with contents other than P, such as Q and R. So you find this a piece of it on the second paragraph on the handout. So the second common ground between minimal empiricism and rationalists is a capacity for judgment thus conceived is not a self-standing capacity. The mere idea of a capacity for judgment cannot make intelligible the kind of activity that it wants to make intelligible unless it is conceived as a capacity that cooperates with a capacity for perception. So my question is, so what is this second thought? Why this cooperating capacity? What's the need for that? And so I think both minimal empiricism and rationalism have two different answers to that question. So according to minimal empiricism, what motivates the need for another capacity typically takes the form of the following regress argument. Imagine I answer the question, why do you judge P, by saying because I judge Q, and the question, why do you judge Q, by saying because I judge R, and the question, why do you judge R, by saying because I judge S. What I'm doing in this series of answers is changing the content of the judgment. I rest P on Q, Q on R, and R on S, while holding constant the nexus between the respective content and myself. Each time the nexus is that of judging, even as the content varies. Thus, at no point in this series of answers is the explanation of the judgment such that as to answer the original question, because every answer solicits the same kind of question, just with respect to a different content. So it follows that there must be an explanation of judgment that answers the question, why do you judge P? Not by adducing a different content from the one that is to be grounded, but instead by adducing a different sort of nexus to this content, namely one that explains judgment in a way that forecloses the possibility of soliciting the kind of question from which we began. Now this can only be so, the argument goes, if there is another capacity distinct from the capacity to judge that is the source of episodes that exhibit such a different sort of nexus between myself and the content that I come to judge on their basis. The idea of a rational capacity for perception is supposed to be this other capacity. So minimal empiricism thinks that the capacity for perception that must cooperate with the capacity for judgment, for the latter to have content that, qua being the content of a judgment, is endorsed as true, can only do its job, providing a judgment's content, if it provides, as such, a ground for a subject to endorse this very content. Only then can it explain its content. And that is, if it already partakes of those capacities that define the idea of rationality, that is, conceptual capacities. So the idea is that the perceivings that result from the capacity for perception must have an objective content, just as judgments do. What distinguishes perceivings from judgments, according to the position, is that in perceiving how things are, the content of the act, that the object is thus and so, is given to the subject through the object's being thus and so. By contrast, a judgment is an activity whose content is not given to the subject, but a product of the subject's cognitive activity. Its content is a matter of cognitive work under the control of the subject, rather than something that the subject finds herself, I quote McDowell, settled with. So the idea of a rational capacity for perception is supposed to address the problem of judgment's emptiness. An episode whose conceptual content is partly explained by the very fact that is the conceptual content of the judgment based on it is supposed to explain why the subject judges that P rather than Q or S in a rational manner. For an episode of this sort is supposed to provide a ground for a judgment that is available to the subject herself, in virtue of which she herself can justify her judgment in a manner that reveals the judgment to be true and hence to be an act of knowledge. So to have perceptual knowledge, according to this account, is to be in a state, as McDowell puts it, I quote, that includes knowledge of its own credentials as knowledge. Or as I put it, that is conscious of itself as knowledge. I have the quote, you find the quotation on the first page, third section. It's the last one. If one knows, so this is from McDowell. If one knows through perception that there is something red and rectangular in front of one, one's knowledge includes knowledge, at least implicit, of its own credentials as knowledge. And it is knowledge because it is a non-defective act of a capacity to be in positions in which one knowingly has present to one environmental realities, such that in knowingly having them present to one, one knowingly has conclusive warrant for relevantly related beliefs. End of quote. Now rationalism denies this picture. Rationalism denies that perception can play a rational role in the formation of judgment. Minimal empiricism is incoherent. Now the incoherence takes the form of a dilemma of two ways of reading the idea of perception that is supposed to provide a ground for knowledge. So either, the argument goes, the perceptions that are to be rational grounds for knowledge are epistemic perceptions whose conceptual contents are facts. In order for perception to have a conceptual content that is factive, its subject must truly judge that things are thus and so. However, if the relevant perception already involves judging that things are so, then it cannot be a ground that justifies the subject's judgment. So this is the one horn of the dilemma. The other horn is all of these perceptions are non-epistemic perceptions that have no conceptual content, however, then they cannot rationally ground judgment. So, and I think that this is the argument made by Barry Stroud and several others, and I think that it catches an ambivalence in the position of the minimal empiricist. The ambivalence of minimal empiricism, I think, is condensed in McDowell's employment of the locution of, I quote, being, as you've seen it in the quotation, being in a position to know, by which he characterizes what it is for a rational perceiver to perceive an object. Someone who perceives an object, McDowell says, is in a position perceptually to know that it is thus and so. However, the idea of being in a position to know raises the question of what kind of episode it describes. Does being in a position to know describe a self-conscious episode of perception, or does it describe a non-self-conscious episode of perception? If the former, then being in a position to know means that she is conscious of herself as seeing that things are thus and so. And in this case, however, her being in a position to know is simply identical to knowing that things are thus and so. And if the latter, then she who is in a position to know ascribes to herself something other than a perception, for example, the appearance of a perception. However, then she is not in a position to know, because she then confronts the question whether that appearance is a mere appearance or whether it actually is a perception. And someone who confronts this question cannot be said to be in a position to know, because it takes, in one way or another, cognitive work to answer this question. So this is the dilemma, as it were, and I think it catches it captures the ambivalence in that phrase The objection against minimal empiricism is that it is impossible to conceive of perception as a capacity whose operations as such are available to a subject as a justification of a judgment. The rationalist concludes that we must understand Kant's two-stem doctrine to suggest the following analysis of perceptual knowledge. We must analyze perceptual knowledge in terms of an act to endorse a propositional content as true that is enabled by a non-epistemic perception whose role it is to bring the object into the subjective life of the thinker, as Stroud is happy to say, who takes up this phrase from John Campbell. So according to rationalism, the role of perception is to explain the transition of a thinker from a state in which the object is not yet part of her subjective life into a state in which it is part of her subjective life. The crucial point here is that the fact that an object is part of the subjective life of the thinker in virtue of being perceived by her does not mean that it is revealed to the thinker that the object is such and such. As such, it has no bearing on the epistemic standing of the subject from the point of view of the subject. In consequence, the conditions for perceiving an object and the conditions for thinking and judging about it are distinct in the sense that one's capacity to perceive an object does not entail that the object one perceives as such is a thinkable object. That one perceives something does not as such entail that one is able to think what one perceives. Stroud is not worried about this gap. He does not even raise the question whether one might think it to be troublesome. Kant, by contrast, addresses this question. He addresses this gap in form of the following worry. Is it possible that the unity of that which is given to us in intuition is such that the concepts that the understanding employs to bring about the unity of a judgment are not valid of it? If this were the case, Kant thinks, and that's the beginning of the Transcendental deduction, then the very idea of a capacity for judgment would turn out to be a Hirngespinst, a mere figment of the mind. So the work of the Transcendental deduction is to address this worry by showing that the possibility that motivates the worry is an illusion. So Kant takes himself to show that the worry, is it possible that the subjective conditions for judgments could never be applied to an object being given in intuition? He takes himself to show that the worry is only a seeming worry, because the very idea of a manifold to be given to one in an intuition already presupposes the employment of the concepts of the understanding in virtue of which it brings about the unity of a judgment. By contrast, when Stroud is not worried about the possibility that the objects of perception, qua being perceived, could be such that the concepts one employs to bring about the unity of a judgment would not be valid of it, when he is not worried about that, this is not because he has entitled himself to think that this possibility is an illusion. Because this possibility, and hence the related worry, could only be an illusion if he were in a position to think that the conditions of perceiving an object and the conditions for thinking an object were the same. But this is precisely what Stroud denies. For one to be able to think an object, it is not enough to be able to perceive it. A further and different condition must be satisfied. One must possess conceptual capacities that one can employ to make judgment. And this is a further condition for the thinkability of an object. So Kant thought that it is impossible to grant such a gap without thereby dissolving the very idea of a capacity for judgment. It would turn out to be a Hirngespinst. And indeed, this is what happens to the concept of judgment from which the rationalist begins. It dissolves. Because if we grant that the conditions for perceiving and judging fall apart, then it follows that one's judging an object to be thus and so does not entail the thought that the content which one endorses as true is such that it can be perceived, let alone that it is perceived. Now the argument comes from the other side now, from judging. How does things look from judging? So however, if that is so if one's thinking something to be thus and so does not as such entail that the object can be perceived, or that it is actually perceived, then this raises the question, what on this account enables one to think that any judgment one makes to be about an object, on account of which the judgment is either true or false, rather than a combination of representations that is grounded in other combinations of representations and so forth, none of which, however, provides for a subject's thought that the content of its representation is an object on account of which the judgment is either true or false. So this brings us back to the point of minimal empiricism, which is to insist that unless there is a manner of revealing a judgment to be true by reference to something other than other judgments, the very idea of a capacity for judgment is empty. So, it seems like we're stuck in a dilemma that I want to briefly formalize. It's section 5 on the handout. So the idea that judging is a conceptual activity seems to require that we endorse the following two pair of thoughts. First, judging, qua act of a conceptual capacity, must be rationally grounded in something that does not entail judgment. Second, judging qua act of a conceptual capacity can only be rationally grounded in something that already entails judgment. So, minimal empiricism and rationalism both think that it is impossible to combine both claims. So, they either opt for one of them. We cannot hold both claims together. So the minimal empiricist thinks that in order to hold on to the first claim, Kant's distinction between sensibility and understanding must be understood as a distinction between two capacities that on the one hand are distinct from each other in the sense that they are capacities whose exercises have distinct acts, but that are on the other hand logically dependent upon each other in the sense that one cannot have one of them unless one has both of them. So there's a logical relation between two capacities. This must be so because the idea of judging as a conceptual activity is the idea of judging as an activity whose ground as such is self-conscious. And this suggests that we must read Kant's thought that he expresses in paragraph 15 of the Transcendental deduction as follows. When Kant says that any combination of a manifold is a representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold, he wants to say first that any combination of a manifold is only a combination of a manifold if it contains a consciousness of itself. And in this sense, any activity of combination is an activity of the understanding whose form is self-consciousness. And second, that this does not mean that judging is the only manner of bringing about such a synthetic unity, but only, as McDowell is happy to say, its paradigmatic instance. We must rather take Kant to say that there must be two ways of synthesizing a manifold of a unity that is conscious of itself. That is, there must be another way of synthesizing a manifold that is conscious of itself that is not yet a judgment, for judging to be intelligible as an activity whose content is able to represent how things are. The rationalist, by contrast, thinks that we must read paragraph 15 in a strict sense. The idea of an activity of combination that is conscious of itself is identical with the idea of judging. Judging is not the paradigmatic activity of self-conscious synthesis, but identical with it. The two-stem doctrine must thus be read as the idea that the capacity for perception with which the capacity for judging cooperates is a capacity that is logically independent from judging. It's an enabling condition. So, in the remainder of this paper, I will argue that both claims that are taken to contradict each other, do I have time? No. To contradict each other, articulate a truth about the capacity for judging, both claims. There is no contradiction between both claims once we dislodge the assumption that drives the debate between minimal empiricism and rationalism. Which, to emphasize again, both of them take themselves to be readings of Kant. The assumption is that the idea of a ground which is the point of the debate, whether a perceptual judgment is such that it does have a rational ground or not, whether this is an intelligible idea. The assumption is that the idea of a ground that reveals the truth of a judgment is the idea of something actual, an act or episode, which the judging subject comprehends to be a particular instance of a capacity by which she explains her judgment. It is the assumption that to have a ground that reveals the truth of a judgment is to be in a particular state of consciousness that is available to one as something actual, that explains one's transition from one's capacity to judge that P to one's actualization of this capacity in an act of judging that P. So the idea is that there is another particular state that explains this, a particular state in which I am, a particular conscious state that explains the transition from me having the capacity to judge that P to the actualization of that capacity in a judgment that P. And so I think that this is the main assumption in both accounts, and that they only debate about how this other particular state, the so-called perceptual state, how it explains this transition, whether it merely causally explains the transition or whether it explains it rationally. So. And I think that the confusion stems from a blindness toward the very idea of a capacity which is taken simply for granted in the debate, but whose implications are not thought through. So once we remove this blindness, we will be able to acknowledge that the capacity for judgment is a capacity that takes care of itself, as it were. Because it will enable us to recognize that a capacity for judgment is nothing other than a self-conscious capacity, either for perceptual or inferential knowledge. The capacity for judgment has no cooperation partner. Perception is not a cooperation partner of the capacity for judgment, but one of two interdependent manners of exercising it. In order to see this, I want to recall a distinction that Kant himself employs, as is well known, several times in the first critique. The distinction between an infinite and a finite intellect. An infinite intellect is an intellect, according to Kant and the tradition, to which the distinction between the unity of the manifold, that is the content of its self-consciousness, and the unity of self-consciousness is not applicable. And because of that, the infinite intellect is an understanding to whom, I quote Kant, the principle of the original synthetic unity of a perception does not apply. And that is, whose self-consciousness does not consist in the self-consciousness of an activity of synthesis. You find Kant on the distinction between finite and infinite intellect on paragraph 6 on the handout. I quote, so I read it. This principle, that is, which I said before, the principle of the original synthetic unity of a perception is not, however, to be taken as applying to every possible understanding, but only to that understanding through whose pure a perception in the representation I am, nothing manifold is given, an understanding which, through its self-consciousness, could supply to itself that manifold of intuition, an understanding, that is to say, through whose representation the objects of the representation should at the same time exist, would not require for the unity of consciousness a special act of synthesis of the manifold. So the activity of an intellect to whom the distinction between the unity of what it is conscious of and the unity of self-consciousness does not apply, does not consist in an activity of synthesis, and hence its activity is not an activity of thinking and judging. The infinite intellect does not think the unity of the manifold, because the unity of what it thinks and the unity of its thinking it are not two distinct unities. However, if that is so, then we must conclude that the activity of an infinite intellect cannot be characterized in terms of a distinction that has guided our account of the understanding right from the start, namely in terms of the distinction between what the understanding is qua capacity and what it is qua act. Thomas Aquinas has argued along these lines, and I take Kant to agree with Aquinas' account on this point. Aquinas argues that the most fundamental contrast between finite and infinite knowledge is that, I quote Aquinas, knowledge is not a quality of God, nor a habit, but substance and pure act. So, end of quote. What distinguishes God's knowledge from finite knowledge of whatever kind is that God's knowledge is an actus purus, a pure act. God's knowledge, Aquinas says, I quote, does not exist in God after the mode of created knowledge, so as to be universal or particular or habitual or potential or existing according to any such mode, end of quote. By contrast, the finite intellect is something for which the distinction between knowledge qua potentia or habitus on the one hand and knowledge qua act on the other is constitutive. This is, as it were, that it divides itself into potentia and actualization. It is knowledge that comes to be. It is knowledge that consists qua act in a transition from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge. And this is what Kant says when he argues that, I quote, the principle of the original synthetic unity of a perception, find the last quotation on the handout, is a condition under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me. Something becomes an object for me, for otherwise, in the absence of this synthesis, the manifold would not be united in one consciousness. So to think of judging as something that does not only exist as an act, and thereby being an actus purus, but also and essentially as a capacity, is to think of judging as something that contains, as such, we must, in order to understand this distinction between capacity and act, it must contain the idea of conditions by which we understand, on the one hand, the possibility that judgment not be in act, and on the other hand, its actuality. Let's call this the capacity act principle. This is the requirement that any account of a concept that divides itself into the description of a capacity as well as an act, as for example the concept of judging, it describes a capacity and an act. It must contain the idea of conditions that explain both the possibility of distinguishing the capacity from its act, for it to not be an actus purus, as well as the transition from capacity to act. So thus, according to the capacity act principle, the concept of judging must contain the idea of conditions that explain both the possibility of distinguishing between judging qua capacity and judging qua act, as well as the transition from one to the other. So now the question is, what are these conditions? So in order for such conditions to explain the possibility that the capacity for judging not be in act, to say that you are able to judge how the weather is, but exactly don't see you. You don't judge it right now. So in order for these conditions to explain the possibility that the capacity for judging not be in act, these conditions must be such as to be either actual or potential. For if it were impossible for these conditions to be potential, it would be impossible for them to explain the possibility that the capacity for judging not be in act. If it were impossible for these conditions to be actual, it would be impossible for them to explain the capacity's actuality. And that is, it would be impossible for them to explain the transition from one's being merely able to judge that P to actually judging that P. So what are these conditions? What are these conditions that fulfill that requirement? That explanatory requirement. So a judgment, as we have seen Kant arguing, is an act that is, as such, conscious of the capacity as its ground. To explain a judgment thus means to explain something that entails a consciousness of that which explains it. It follows that the explanation of the subject's transition from capacity to act must be one in the light of the subject's consciousness of her capacity, whose activity is at issue, and hence render her activity intelligible to herself. I will argue that the idea of conditions under which the truth of a judgment is revealed to the subject gives us the idea of this explanation that satisfies this requirement. For a subject who endorses the truth of a propositional content under conditions that reveal its truth has an explanation of her endorsement of the truth of P that renders her activity intelligible to herself by rendering anything other than judging that P to be less than fully intelligible, such as, for example, denying the truth of P or withholding the endorsement of P. We might call conditions of judging under which the truth of a propositional content is revealed to a subject conditions of knowledge, because a subject who judges that P under such conditions under which the truth of a judgment is revealed to her, has an explanation for why she judges that P that is incompatible not only with the judgment's falsity, but also with her not endorsing its truth. By contrast, if someone judges under conditions other than those under which the truth of one's judgment is revealed to one, then the explanation of her judgment is compatible not only with her judgment's falsity, but also with one not endorsing it. Such conditions can, at best, seem to reveal the truth to her, and hence seem to be incompatible with her not endorsing it without actually doing so. It is a trivial consequence of this account that a judgment can be dependent upon conditions under which the truth of a propositional content is revealed to a subject in two ways. It can be dependent upon them either directly, when the transition from capacity to act does not depend on anything other than these conditions, or indirectly, when the transition from capacity to act depends on other judgments from which the truth of the proposition in question is inferred. So when the former is the case, the subject acquires what we, for this reason, call perceptual knowledge. In the latter case, it acquires, accordingly, inferential knowledge. You see, the explanatory order is different. I do not explain the immediacy through perception, but the other way around. I explain perception through the immediacy of the explanation. Okay, yeah, I will be done in 3 minutes. These considerations have decisive consequences for our understanding of the role of the concept of perception in the life of a judger. The role of the concept of perception, as it is part of the consciousness of a being that is able to judge, is thus not to specify a capacity that is distinct from judging. It specifies a distinct manner of judging, which is distinguished from another manner of judging, not because it has different conditions from it, but because the judgment is enabled by them differently. A perceptual judgment is not a judgment enabled by an act of perception. It is enabled by a capacity whose concept contains the idea of conditions that reveal the truth of a proposition to a subject. And it is therefore, and in this sense, enabled by nothing other than a capacity for knowledge. I argue that it is wrong to think of judgment as a capacity that must be constrained by the exercises of another capacity in order to not be empty. This is not to say that judgment is an unconstrained activity. Rather, it is to say that judgment is an activity of a self-conscious capacity for knowledge. And this entails that it is an activity whose concept contains the idea of conditions that explain, on the one hand, the possibility of the subject's having concepts that she can employ in judgments without her actually doing so. Namely, when these conditions do not obtain, when the truth of a proposition is not revealed to the subject. And it, as well as it explains her actual employment of them in a judgment of knowledge, which entails trivially in this account that these conditions obtain. So an utterance of the form, I believe that P because I see it, gives voice, that's the suggestion, to this form of explanation. In such an explanation, no appeal is made to an occurrence of passive impressions, no matter how we construe them, whether conceptually contentful or not. The appeal is to the capacity for knowledge whose distinctive manner of exercise one thereby specifies. So the explanation of judgment therefore not only entails that the judgment is revealed to be true, but also a specification of the distinctive manner of how it is revealed to be true. So that's the point. So someone who knows something not only knows that she knows something, but she also knows how she knows it. So he knows the distinctive manner of knowing it. So thus what explains a subject's judgment is not another act or episode in which she finds herself, but the subject's capacity for knowledge, whose concept she has, and which contains the idea of conditions whose obtaining explains the transition from capacity to act. So what explains judgment's actuality is thus, and in this sense, nothing other than this capacity. And I think this enables us to hold on to the thought that judgment must be grounded in something other than judgment, without having to deny that it cannot be grounded in something other than judgment. If we give up the assumption that this something other is a particular act or episode, but rather conceive it as something that is distinct from the act of judgment, not in being another act, but in being its capacity, then there is nothing that hinders us to also embrace the second thought. Both thoughts construed that way can be combined with each other because they then describe the same ground seen from two different sides. Thank you very much for listening.